Welcome to Everyday Truth with Kurt Skelly. We believe the Bible is true and relevant to everyone, everywhere, every day. Today, we join Kurt at one of the many biblical and historical sites in Greece. To fully experience these incredible sites, be sure to watch each day's video on YouTube. Now, let's see where Kurt is today.
City of Cenchrea. Not much to see. You kind of have to use your imagination, but the reason I like to come here is twofold. Number one, nobody comes here. And I'm like, why not? You get it to yourself. And I love going to spots where you're not surrounded by other tourists and you have the opportunity to see the landscape. So you try to envision this place without these houses. But honestly, the landscape has not changed since the time the Apostle Paul was here. You look at these mountains. We're looking now to the east. This is the Saronic Gulf, which eventually feeds the Aegean. So understand that when trade ships during the days of the Apostle Paul would come here, then from here, they would portage over the Isthmus, what was called the Dialkos. Remember, we described how that system worked of transporting this tiny ships or the cargo across the Isthmus to the Gulf of Corinth, and then that goes out to Rome. So this would save money and time and provide a much safer route to transport goods. So for that reason, this was a very important strategic city, Cenchrea, that served Corinth. On this side, Lechion was the city on the opposite side that served Corinth that way. Now, enough about all that. The Bible says there was a church at Cenchrea, or we mispronounce it Cenchrea. What do we know about that church? Not a whole lot, but here's a couple things we know. First of all, we know that the Apostle Paul came here with Priscilla and Aquila after the second missionary journey. So we know that. So they left from here. Now I want you to think about Priscilla and Aquila because they are footnotes in the Bible, but they're among the most important people in church history. Say, how do you know that? Because Paul said that. Paul said in Romans 16 and verse 3 and verse 4 that every Gentile church ought to write Aquila and Priscilla a thank you note because they laid down their necks for the Apostle Paul. So they were a great couple. So think about it. They've now been discipled, 18 months with Paul. They leave from Cenchrea. Where do they go? They go to Ephesus. Guess where we're going tomorrow? Ephesus. We won't get there tomorrow, but that's where we're going. So we're basically doing the same sailing expedition, a little bit nicer quarters in our cruise boat that Paul and Priscilla and Aquila did. Now here's what happened. They got to Ephesus. Paul left them there. He said, you guys stay here and do ministry. He went on to Jerusalem. He comes back for the third missionary journey, but in the meantime, Priscilla and Aquila hear this guy preach from Alexandria, and this guy believes the Messiah because he's been exposed to the ministry of John the Baptist, but he's not fully indoctrinated yet in Christian theology. His name is Apollos. And Priscilla and Aquila help Apollos fill in those theological gaps. Apollos comes from Ephesus here, and he preaches in Corinth the gospel, and guess who he reaches? Jews. Guess who Paul had trouble reaching in Corinth? Jews. So think about this. Paul reached somebody who reached somebody who reached the somebodies he wanted to reach. Right? Because Paul reached Priscilla and Aquila, who reached Apollos, who reached the Jews, who Paul originally tried to reach. So just the amazing sequence of the gospel. So Paul leaves here. Now, when does Paul come back to Corinth? On the third missionary journey. So 55, 56, 56, 57, somewhere in there, at the end of the 3 years that Paul spends at Ephesus, he comes back to Corinth. He spends 3 months. During that 3 months, he writes Romans. He's done writing Romans. He comes to Cenchrea, to go back to Jerusalem. Why? He has all this money he's collected from all the poor saints. He wants to get them to this money, this offering to Jerusalem. He's got all these delegates from all these churches with him. But here's what happens. There is a plot to kill him among the unbelieving Jews. They want to kill him. Paul finds out about that plot right here. So guess what he does? Instead of getting on the boat, he takes the land route. The same route that we're going to take on Monday. And he goes all the way back up, all the way back to Thessalonica, all the way back out to Neapolis, sails all the way back to Troas. He spends Passover in Philippi. That all happens from here. But while he's here, before he leaves because of that plot, he hands a newly written letter to a lady by the name of Phoebe. Phoebe is from Cenchrea. Who is she? Well, the Bible says she's a servant. It's the word diakonos. She's a servant. Some people believe she was actually a deaconess right here in this church. And then number two, she was, the Old English word is a succorer of many. But what the word literally means is she was a patron. And what that means is she was a rich woman who financially supported the ministry. She had the means, the clout, the authority to be able to take this letter as a courier for the Apostle Paul and bring it across the Isthmus, get on a boat in Lechion, and go to Rome and give them that letter, in which the Apostle Paul gave them all his travel plans. Romans chapter 15. Hey, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. Pray for me that it all goes well. I'm going to come see you guys. I'm going to go off to Spain. Just pray that it all goes well. Well, they must not have prayed because it didn't all go well. He got arrested in Jerusalem. He's imprisoned in Caesarea. He gets on a ship and goes to Rome, shipwrecks and snake bites and all of that. So think about it. This city is a lot bigger than you think it is. One last thought. Priscilla and Aquila. Where were they from? Pontus. You ever read that? Pontus. Where's that? That's all the way up by the Black Sea. So they're born in Pontus. They're tent makers. Tent making was a job you could travel because you just had your tools in your little pouch, and then you go to place to place to place. You follow like the Olympic Games or the Isthmian Games because that's where they need temporary shelters, right? So they go from Pontus to Rome. They get kicked out of Rome by Claudius. They come to Corinth. They meet Paul. They're here 18 months. They leave with Paul to Ephesus. The Bible says when Paul comes back to Ephesus and spends 3 years there, he greets the church at Corinth and says, hey, Priscilla and Aquila want to greet you too. And the church that's in their house, now they manage a house church. Then Paul writes Romans and says, hey, greet Priscilla and Aquila. Now they're in Rome because the edict has been lifted. And then he writes a letter from Rome years later, his second Roman imprisonment, and writes back to Ephesus and says, hey, say hey to Priscilla and Aquila. So think about them. Pontus, Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Rome, Ephesus. Just people that were willing to go, willing to stay, willing to serve God, willing to be behind the scenes. That's who most of us are. Most of us aren't famous people. We're just Priscillas and Aquilas who love the Lord, who do our job, that say, Lord, I'm ready to go. Whatever you have for me to do. Wow. And then think about this. Paul, one time, came here intending to leave on a boat, and he did. One time he came here intending to leave on a boat, and he didn't. You know, sometimes in our life, God guides our circumstances, and we think we know where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. But God has his sovereign plans, doesn't he? God mixes things around. Sometimes you get on the boat, sometimes you don't. But in both cases, God was large, God was in charge, God was doing something. So I love stopping at Cenchrea because you just learn a whole lot of things that you thought were footnotes in the Bible. One last thing, this is my third one last thing. You know, Paul, for those 3 months, stayed with a guy by the name of Gaius in Corinth. You know who Gaius was? One of the first people he led to Christ. 1 Corinthians 1:14. Hey, I baptized him. Didn't baptize many people, but I baptized Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. I baptized Gaius. And then he says in Romans, and Gaius has been my host. So here's this new convert, one of the first people that Paul led to Christ in Corinth. that now when he comes back, hey, stay at my house. And by the way, the church meets here too. Isn't that special? So just a very, very special spot.